All right, good morning and welcome to Sunday School, Adult Sunday School at Cliffview Chapel on August the 16th? 16th, yes, 2020. I just want to rush through the rest of this year. Get to March, right? Is that when I had real reliable scientific guy tell me March. This is all going to be over in March. So I'll give you his name if it doesn't come true, but I'm hiding it until then. Yeah, so just in case. So, Gerald, there's a couple up here. Oh, it's in here. Yeah. All right. Well, good to be back. We missed you last week. Thank you for your faithfulness in being here. And we had a wonderful time in Moab. Moab always, they're a wonderful host. They just celebrated their 40th anniversary. It was actually supposed to be in April, and they had to postpone it. So this was the makeup day for them. The town of Moab, they're kind of over all this. I'm looking around thinking, well, this is, it's not as busy as it usually is, not at the international travelers, but it's still, busy. People are still going about their way. The church there is bouncing back pretty good. Of course, they had a nice dinner, so that always helps when you have a dinner for people, motivating them to come to church. What's that, Gerald? Yeah, really. Someone says, how you know you're called to preach, to be a Baptist preacher is you like fried chicken and you like to talk. So, but it was a nice spread they had there. He said they had 85 there. They usually run around 75. After the COVID restrictions were lifted, they were running about 45. So Sunday they had a nice turnout. But there were some guests. They actually had a family of 8 from California, believe it or not. And they said, this is refreshing to be in Utah. So I would think so. Anywhere is refreshing compared to California, on it. But we're glad to be back. We came back Sunday afternoon, got here back home Sunday evening. Drew had a dentist appointment early Monday, so it'd be back. But it was nice. Always a good church. They're getting ready to replace the carpet in there. Eddie knows that church because he's been there a number of times. Replace the carpet in their auditorium, and I think it's their auditorium is 50 by 80, so it's a pretty good sized room. So they just finished getting the funding for that, so they're all excited. And they're the kind of place that always is pushing forward and always keeping things up to date and nice and comfortable and whatnot. So if you're ever in Moab, stop there on a Sunday and visit with them. We're in Nehemiah. We're on this chart here at the end of the temple phase. And I'm not sure how I got that bar there. I thought I could get rid of that toolbar, but it's just not working. But anyhow, I think everybody's probably filled in what they need. But obviously, there's been waves of people that have left the Babylonian captivity and gone back to redo Jerusalem. They built a temple, and then they started to build the walls, and they slowed down, and they stopped opposition. Nehemiah is there, and he's the man who's going to help them finish and inspire them to build the wall, finish building the wall. We left off in chapter 9. We were going through some of these things, so chapter 9... the book breaks down, if you remember, that the first part of the book is about getting the people to build the walls and the gates of the city, getting them and motivated and prepared and protected. Chapters 1 through 6. Chapters 7 through 13 is re-instructing the people. Now the walls are finished, to learn how to serve God like they should be, to get back, have a spiritual revival. Chapter 7 was the census, the re-registration of the people that were there. They had to come back. Chapter 8 is there's the Nehemiah, chapter 8. There's a rereading of the law again. It's probably been a while since people heard the law read. And remember, they didn't maybe all have individual copies because they were all scribes would do them by hand. So it was a pleasure to go and hear the law read. And then chapters 9 and 10 is where the people are going to rededicate themselves. The word also could be used consecrate themselves again for the work of the Lord. And that's where he left off in chapter number 9. The first 3 verses, the children of Israel assemble in verse 1. They're doing fasting. They're putting on sackcloth. They're putting earth up on themselves. Often they would throw earth on their head, dirt on their head, as a sign of humility before the Lord. Verse 2, they were confessing their sins and also how their fathers had iniquities. Verse 3, they stood up in the place and read in the book of the law of the people. And so they're worshiping God. They're having essentially the beginning of a revival here. Verse number 4, it's the priests are now starting to confess, and the Levites. Remember, Levites were one of the 12 tribes that had dedicated themselves to serving God. So they were temple people. And it says in verse number 5, at the end of the verse, stand up and bless the Lord your God forever and ever, and blessed be thy glorious name, which is exalted above all blessing and praise. And what's going to happen is there's going to be this prayer that is going to be said here. That's the beginning of it there. Verse 6 says, thou, even thou art Lord alone. Thou hast made heaven and the heaven of heavens. What is that little phrase, heaven of heavens? Because it's talking about you made the heavens. We know there's the heaven where the clouds and the birds are. And then we know there's outer space heaven. But the third heaven, and remember we say 3 heavens. Don't mix it up with LDS theology, because their understanding of heaven is not biblically rooted. But when we say heaven of heavens, that is the abode of God. They're referring to the third heaven. The heaven is beyond where we can see and know. It's where God makes his abode as on his throne, although he's omnipresent and has presence everywhere. And it goes on to say, with all their host, the earth, and all things that are therein, the seas, and all that is therein, and thou preservest them all, and the host of heaven worshipeth thee. So what's that mean? What is he giving God glory for in that verse, primarily? What act? Yeah, creation act. And you'll see that quite often when people pray or when they go to preach, particularly to either non-Jewish people that wouldn't have believed in monotheism, only one God, or Jewish people that were not in tune with God. They would always start out with this whole thing based on creation. So what's that tell us? Well, it tells us that if we don't have a good theology of creation, number one, we're not going to honor God. Because this was praising God, wasn't it? They were exalting him. They were above, alone, because he made heaven. So we're not going to be able to honor God. And then the other thing is people aren't going to have a good base. Because if evolution or anything about evolution creeps into our thinking, our theology, then it takes away the power and honor from God. It takes away the credit for what he should get for doing and gives it to the laws of nature or some act as such. And God is not fond of that at all, huh? So that's what he does. And then he starts into the history about Abraham in verse number 7. Thou art the Lord the God, who chose Abram and broughtest him forth out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and givest him the name of Abraham. Verse 8, and foundest his heart faithful before thee. Notice that little phrase, and these are all important things in this prayer. Thou foundest faithfulness in his heart. Now, we looked at a lot of people in the Old Testament, book of Judges, remember that series? And found out in this Sunday school series that a lot of people were not always the most moral people in this sense. Think of King David. He had some pretty significant moral failures, even in the sight of secular thinking people. You know, he commits adultery with another man's wife, then has the man killed off, because she had gotten pregnant. I mean, those are pretty significant things, right? Conspiracy to murder, adultery, and other things. And yet God says he's a man after God's own heart, and Jesus sat on the throne of who? David. So you're saying, wow, how does that make sense? It's because there was one thing that God was really looking for in the lives of people that he was going to use. And Hebrews 11 tells us that. What's in Hebrews 11? It's, the hall of these really faithful saints. And it's all, and most of the sections in Hebrews 11 begins with, by faith, by faith, by faith they did this, by faith they did that. Even Samson, it says, by faith. So we often look at our lives and think, God cannot use me because I'm not perfect. Well, if that was the criteria, then no one would be used while they were on earth. And certainly we should strive to be holy. God says that. But one thing we can often do is be faithful. And God will often use faithful people that are not necessarily the most perfect people, if we can get a grasp around that. And God found faithfulness in his heart. It talks about in verse number 8, he did see the affliction of their fathers, these people he's talking to, their ancestors in Egypt. We know that story. And heardest their cries by the Red Sea. Hey, you got us out of Egypt, but now we're going to die because the Egyptians are going to catch up with us. And what did he do? We know that story. Verse 10, and show us signs and wonders upon Pharaoh. You listen or read about all those plagues that God sent to convince Pharaoh to let the people of God go. And verse 11, thou didst divide the sea before them, so that they went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and their prosecutors thou threwest into the deeps as a stone into the mighty waters. We know that story. So what's he doing? He's rehearsing their history. Because quite often people who forget their history, what they say, are bound to repeat it. People who forget their history will often forget the historian God. And their faith will be in their own confidence rather than what God has done and will do. And he goes on, verse 12, thou leadest them in the day by a cloudy pillar, and in the night by a pillar of fire, to give them light in the way wherein thou shalt go. What are they? They're in the wilderness for 40 years, basically going in circles. And God's leading them. Now, the journey wouldn't have taken 40 years. But here again, God's people are like sheep sometime, and they make stupid choices. And so he was teaching them lessons. And then when they get to the promised land, of all the people that left Egypt, which ones that got into the promised land? Only those that were under 20, because the rest of them, they were going to die before they got there for their offense against God. But he brought that young generation in. And so verse number 13, thou comest down also upon Mount Sinai and speakest with them from heaven. Verse number 14, thou hast made known unto them thy holy Sabbath, and commandest them precepts and statutes and laws by the hand of Moses. Verse 15, thou givest them bread from heaven for their hunger. Remember the manna? We sing that little chorus, the windows of heaven is open. Talks about the manna coming down. Verse 15, the second part of verse 15, and broughtest forth water from them out of a rock for their thirst. All Moses had to do is strike the rock, and water started coming. He didn't do so well there, did he? He did it twice, thinking, well, God says once, I'll do it twice, because just got to be sure. Verse 16, but they and our fathers dealt proudly. Out of God doing all that stuff for them, what was the people's reaction? Pride. Thou did proudly, and hardened their necks, and he hearkened not to thy commandments, and refused to obey, neither were mindful of thy wonders that thou didst among them, but hardened their necks, and in their rebellion appointed a captain to return to their bondage. But thou art a God ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, of great kindness, and forsookest them not. Wow. Loaded? Would you say those have a lot of good theology, a lot of good truth in them? Those people, they were proud, they were stiff-necked, they were stubborn, they refused to obey. They didn't think about all the wonderful things that God does. But God, still gracious and merciful, slow to anger. And that's always good news for all of us. Great is thy faithfulness. Verse 18, yet when they made them a molten calf and said, this is thy God that brought thee up out of Egypt and has wrought great provocations. Think about that. All that God did for them, and they make an idol and say, oh, this idol, and the God behind this idol is the one that actually got us out of Egypt. What an insult. I mean, we feel insulted when people perhaps don't give us the blatant credit that is due. We feel a little shafted, I guess, as such. But think about that. And then we go down in verse 21. Yet 40 years thou didst sustain them in the wilderness, so that they lacked nothing. Their clothes waxed not old, and their feet swelled not. That's interesting, isn't it? Do you guys have any clothes from 40 years ago? Beside what's in a museum, I guess. But things don't last. And their feet didn't swell. And this is a miraculous God, a providential God taking care of them 40 years in the wilderness. Verse 22. Moreover, thou givest them kingdoms and nations. All that book of Judges, going in and conquering, and Joshua and Judges. Thou didst divide them into the corners so that they would possess the land. Verse 23, and their children also multipliest thou as the stars of heaven, and broughtest them into the land, concerning which thou promised to their fathers that they should go in to possess it. So can you see this prayer? It's just filled with, it was a teaching prayer. God knew he did all this stuff, but they're giving him, again, glory for it, and at the same time reminding the people of God what they should know and what they've forgotten and what they need to learn again, that God is a wonderful and powerful God. Verse 31. Nevertheless, for thy great mercy's sake, thou didst not utterly consume them, nor forsook them, for thou art a gracious and merciful God. Now watch something here. For what sake did he, what was the main motivation for God not to just go ahead and finish them off? Well, it's for his mercy, great mercy's sake. God made us. He's not interested in just arbitrarily consuming us. Now, he's long-suffering, but judgment will come. And sometimes people will mistake the delay in judgment for that God is slack and he's really not serious about it or can't do anything about it. But he's reminding them it wasn't because God can't. It's because he wanted to give people time. So the first part of this prayer is the praise and confession they're making to God. Now the second part is in verse 32 and following. This is the petition they're making. And also it involves confession. From verse 32 to verse 37, this is them asking God to do some things. Verse number 32, now therefore our God, the great, the mighty, and the terrible God, who keepeth covenant and mercy, let not all the trouble seem little before thee, for thou came upon us, on our kings, and on our princes, and on our priests, and on our prophets, and on our fathers, and on all thy people, since the time the kings of Assyria unto this day, since the time of the invasion of the northern kingdom, through the southern kingdom's invasion and captivity, to this day, that God has been a God who keeps the covenant. He has not broken a promise. He's been impeccable in his reputation. Now watch what they ask in verse 33. Howbeit, thou art just in all that is brought upon us, for thou hast done right, but we have done wickedly. Now watch that verse again for a moment. You're just in all that you brought up on us. You are right in what you've, the suffering we've had to go through in the wilderness, the disease, the plagues, the thirst, the hunger. God, those things are all just. Why? Because you're always right, and we are often wrong. We've done wickedly. Now that's a flash to the past about something that is going to happen in future, in Revelation. When God finally judges all, we'll be in heaven as believers. We're going to observe this. When God judges all, the choir of heaven sings, true and righteous are your judgments. As the people, the choir of heaven sees God's wrath pour out on the people on earth. And the people being saying, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And from casting them into the lake of fire. Things that right now would shake us. We are going to sing with the rest of heaven, "God, that's right. You did the right thing there. True and righteous are your judgments." Now, some of you may say, at least in your mind, "God, that just doesn't seem right, Pastor. Why would God do that? I mean, that just doesn't seem like is that overkill?" But that's because we don't know the total mind of God. We're not totally sanctified or holy in all of our thinking. But when we get to heaven, we will be. That old man will be eradicated totally. We'll be totally sanctified. We'll have a total mind of Christ that we struggle to have now. And we will be able to say with the rest of them, "That's a good thing you did, God." You say, "I don't understand." That's because we have a mind that's still not totally like Christ's mind. We just have to trust God for that one, huh? Look down, if you would, toward the end of this prayer in verse 37. Verse 36, let's say, "Behold, we are servants this day, and for the land that thou gavest unto our fathers to eat the fruit thereof and the good thereof, behold, we are servants in it. And it yieldeth much increase unto the kings whom thou settest over us because of our sins. Also they have dominion over our bodies and over our cattle at their pleasure, and we are in great distress." Now, what are they referring back to? That captivity they came out of. God, you allowed those kings, that Babylonian king, to cause us great distress and rule over us. Are we seeing that now, where it looks like overlords are ruling over us in certain parts of our country? And it could be that God is teaching us a lesson as believers. Now, verse 38. "And because of all this, we make a sure covenant." That's what he's now telling. He's prayed to God and he's telling the people. Because of what we told you in this prayer, we make a sure covenant and write it, and our princes, Levites, and priests seal unto it. In other words, they're making a promise. We rededicate ourselves, God. We again promise you new and afresh that we will follow you, will be your people. And it sounds like they have written it out. And now they're going to take the priest and the Levites and the princes, and they're going to put their seal up on it, just like a king would to seal a document to show it's authentic as such. So that's chapter number 9. Chapter number 10 is more of the same. The first part of chapter 10, you see all those names? Does your verses look structured a little different? Yeah, short verses, lots of names. They're listing 21 priestly families in the first 8 verses. These would be significant families of the priesthood. Now, remember, back then, even now, priests before God, which we all are allowed to have families and wives. So, Catholic Church, when they say it has to be a single person, it's not from the Bible. Okay, so when you say priestly families, yeah, they would have had families. Verses 9 through 13 are 17 Levite families. Those were also temple workers. And then verse 14 to verse 27 were 44 of the leading families in this new walled place, Jerusalem. These significant families, probably large families, each one. So in verse 28 it says, "And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, and so forth, they've all separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, and everyone having knowledge and having understanding." So they dedicating themselves. They're going to not be influenced by the foreign nations, and they're going to separate and be godly people. Verse 29, "And they clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath, to walk in God's law, which is given by Moses, the servant of God, to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his judgments and his statutes, and that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons." So what it is, they're pledging to keep the law, the commandments of God. And they said, we will do it with an oath that if we don't keep it, we will be cursed. So there's repercussions. What's one of the significant ones? Verse 30, will not intermarry with the other nations, the ungodly people. And that's still in the New Testament. God has a stern warnings about people who are his people marrying people who are not his people. Never a good thing. You slice it however you want and try to justify it however you want. It just doesn't work. And you say, but I know a story of a good Christian girl who dated this boy, wasn't a Christian, and then he got saved. But that's not God's plan of evangelism. Just because it worked doesn't mean that honored God in how it worked. Goes on down in verse 31. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals unto the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day, and that we would leave the seventh year and the exaction of every debt. Now, what they're doing is, remember, why were they in captivity for 70 years? Because every seventh year they were supposed to give the land rest, and they didn't. And they did that for 490 years. So they had to repay back every missed Sabbath year with a year in captivity. So they're basically saying, we're not going to do that again. We learned our lesson. And then up in verse 32. Also we made ordinances for us to charge ourselves yearly with a third part of the shekel for the service of the house of God. In other words, our giving. We have made ourselves, so we are dedicated to give to God's house, to the work of the Lord. And verse 33, and for showbread, and for the continual meat offering, and for the continual burnt offering of the Sabbaths, of the new moons, of the set feast, and for the holy things, and for the sin offering. For all those offerings, we are going to pay what we should be paying. Verse 35, and to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all the fruit of our trees year by year unto the house of the Lord. We call that the first fruits offering. And the principle in the New Testament is this. Out of every time God gives us resource, so it's a paycheck or whatever, the very first and best part of that goes to God, the portion of it. It's not the leftover. If you were given 10 pristine animals as such, and you say, well, I want to dedicate one of these to God, you don't look for the one that is the least healthy or already has some kind of ailment. They would give the best of the best to God. Verse 38 talks about the tithes, the tithe of the tithes, that they would pay their tithes so it would support the work of the Lord. And then that chapter pretty much ends that they will not forsake, the last phrase in verse 39, and we will not forsake the house of our God. We will not forsake the place of worship, the place where God's temple is. And that today would be his church. Chapter 11 is how the city repopulates, and we're going to stop there because I just don't want to speed through these chapters. They have a lot of teachable moments in it. So we will stop and pick up next time. I know it took a little bit of time to get through that, but I think it's beneficial for us to learn some lessons. So, hey, if you're watching online, join us in about 15 minutes for the morning service that will stream at the same place that you're at right now. So, all right, let's be dismissed in prayer. Father, thank you for the truths of your word and so much teaching that comes from even just a thing as basic as prayer. It can be a teachable moment for us. Father, bless us and prepare us for the service to come, Father. Pray for our church family. Some that need a healing touch or just strength for their journey. Others that need encouragement for their soul and courage. And yet, Father, for others that are struggling with things that we just would never begin to imagine, you know, and we leave them in your good care. Bless our time of worship. May you be honored now.